It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview Brittany Bresley from Boston College, who is an Associate Athletic Director for Compliance. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
That's wonderful. Can you talk about how you got started being an Associate Athletic Director for Compliance?
Sure. So I think that a lot of people in this field kind of stumble into compliance. I was a student athlete myself in undergraduate, and then I went to law school where I knew I loved legal research and writing, and I knew I loved sports, and I wanted to find a way to kind of mesh those together. I was fortunate enough to go to Northeastern for law school, where they have a great co-op program. And my last co-op was actually in Northeastern's athletic compliance office, where I absolutely loved my experience. Made a joke to my boss at the time saying that he wasn't going to get rid of me. And he laughed at the time, but I ended up being there for 4 years. So I just really loved it.
Can you talk about what you've learned whenever you were a student as a compliance officer?
Sure. So when I was a student, I didn't know much about compliance officers. Typically, you see them once every blue moon and then out of sight, out of mind. But I think that the student athletes I have now are a lot more interactive. They're a lot more engaged in talking to us and figuring out these creative things or ideas or businesses that they want to create and making sure that they preserve their eligibility while doing that.
Can you talk about some of the roles, like whenever you were talking about, of course, starting a business as an athlete? What is some of the roles like that?
Sure. So the first and most important thing is making sure that you're not impacting your eligibility. So I'm sure you've seen that there's a lot of name, image, and likeness rules that are coming out and states that are trying to pass legislation in the area. So what we want to do first and foremost is make sure that we're following the current NCAA bylaws as they stand. From there, when this new legislation comes out next year, it's going to be interesting to see how it shifts. But generally, it's making sure that a student isn't using their name or image to promote a commercial entity. So we've had some kids here who have been brand ambassadors for Coca-Cola on campus. It's really important that any activity they do for the company is on the company's Instagram or social media and not directly from their personal social media saying, go buy this product.
That's wonderful. Can you talk about, of course, like with the destroying case, how did that impact, of course, student athletes?
Yeah, so we've had a few cases over the last couple of years that have really impacted student athletes for the positive and for the negative. So anytime there's a new case, whether it be that one or Alston, we need to make sure that we are aware of what's coming out of the court and if it's official, if it's been appealed, if the NCAA is already doing something on their end to either work with the people who are putting in the new legislation. So really, we're kind of the eyes and ears of the community. I like to tell people we're the catch-all office, where if somebody doesn't know who to go to, they usually run into compliance and say, hey, are you the person that does this?
What have you accomplished as a compliance officer?
Wow, that's a good question. So I would say there's several categories of accomplishments. I mean, first and foremost, every semester, making sure that our student athletes are eligible for practice and competition academically is something that we pride ourselves on. We want to make sure that kids can do the work in the classroom so that they can do the work on the field or in the court. I think the other thing that's really fun and exciting is when we have a large waiver that we write to the NCAA committees asking for, say, immediate eligibility for somebody who transferred to our school and wouldn't necessarily be immediately eligible. Those are the big wins that you can kind of hear throughout the entire office and people being really excited about it.
Can you talk about the day-to-day aspect and basis on being a compliance officer?
Yeah, so what I love about compliance is that there isn't a very set day-to-day. So we do have these tasks throughout the academic calendar that happen at the same time. For instance, right now, we are in the National Letter of Intent signing period. So that's been a big thing in our office right now, making sure all of our incoming kids for next fall sign off on their National Letter of Intent and they're valid and we're able to publicize their names. But other than that, we have a list of tasks each day and we wait for a coach or an administrator or a student athlete to come in and ask a different question, which might completely derail your day, but it's really fun and exciting to not know what's coming up next.
Speaking about whenever coaches come in your office to like ask you questions, can you talk about whenever a coach comes into your office to ask to do an interview for a podcast or a local radio station?
Sure. So if a coach comes into our office and wants to do a podcast like this or speak to a reporter, we have a couple of steps that we take care of. We first and foremost connect them with sports information because they're the ones who do most of our requests. But if it is a podcast like this, we actually just had an example of this in the last month or so, where a coach wanted to do a podcast and we need to properly vet who the host is. You know, if they're a high school coach, we need to know that. If they're a student, we need to know that. And we go through that side of the aspect and then leave it up to sports information to go from there.
Can you talk about, of course, like what happens like whenever you get like, for example, I've got denied a few times. What is the backstory behind like the reason of getting denied and stuff?
Sure. So sometimes a denial comes because we can't find enough information online. Sometimes when we're doing our research of who a host is, it's kind of unclear if they are a high school coach or if they work with prospects in any way, shape, or form. The biggest and most important piece of a coach speaking to somebody or doing a podcast would be, is it a high school coach? Because if so, they shouldn't be interacting with them. I think another big one right now is this dead period, which is a lot longer than coaches are used to. We've had kind of a recruiting freeze for almost 6 or 7 months at this point. So it could just be timing. It could be that the coach is busy and is in their recruiting season, or they're thinking about their next competition and they just don't have the availability.
Can you talk about, of course, whenever coaches do come on, what can they talk about when it comes to recruitment?
Sure. So in terms of recruiting, we like to tell our coaches to keep things general. Talk about the process of getting recruited. You know, specifically, you got to get your academics right. You need to get your SAT scores right in order to be able to get onto the court or to the field. And then also coaches do a lot of high school recruit nights. So something that they'll take part in is they'll go to a high school and be on a panel where prospects and their parents will sit and kind of ask them those questions of, how should I communicate to a coach? Or is this too abrupt for me to email the coach 3 times this week? Which the answer is probably yes if you're emailing that many times. But those are really the experiences that I enjoy the most, where the students can ask questions that they're kind of afraid to ask a coach who's recruiting them because they want to make sure that they're giving off a good impression.
Can you talk about some of the favorite things that you do as a compliance officer?
Sure. So I love getting to kind of grow up with the student athletes. I love seeing them come in at 17 or 18, unsure of what they want to do as a career path, and then really watch them grow both athletically and as a person over the next 4 years. You know, there are a lot of kids who are fortunate enough to be able to play pro, whether it's in the country or in another country. But realistically, that's not the vast majority of student athletes. The vast majority go on to a graduate program or a career in something else. And it's really awesome to get to see them get excited and passionate about something and be able to help them towards that goal.
That's so wonderful. Can you talk about what you've learned now that you didn't know before you started as a compliance officer?
Yeah, so I always knew there were rules and regulations because that's what we need to have in order to have compliance officers in the first place. What I didn't know at the time was just how many exceptions there are to those rules. So, you know, we've got this 300-page manual here that sits next to us. And with each bylaw, there might be an exception. There might be 2 exceptions. So something I learned is that it's not just about the bylaw, it's also about the interpretations that the NCAA is putting out or the educational columns. that might have the answer to that really minute detail that you need.
What is something that you did not know that you had to look up in the bylaws?
Yeah, so I think that it depends on what type of office you're in. In the office that we're in right now at BC, we divide by bylaw and not by sport, and some programs do the exact opposite. So every now and again, when there's a question that's not in my area, say if it is recruiting for a particular sport, I might have to go back and check and make sure I know exactly what dates the dead period is for that year.
Where can my listeners find you at on social media, along with, of course, Boston College Compliance at?
Sure. So we have a lot of different Instagram and social media handles at Boston College. We have a generic BC Athletics one. We have a compliance specific one, which if people want to follow, it's BC Compliance. That's on Twitter and Instagram. And we try to be as entertaining as possible on there. We try to get information out to prospective student athletes and the general public, things that are not just specific to our student athletes. And that's really the source that we use.
Thank you again, Brittany, for your interview, and best of luck at BCS for your compliance.
Thanks so much.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Brittany, for your interview, and best of luck.
Thanks. Have a good day.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.